As I stated in the last video, the aim of creating this scene was to act as a starting point to look at scattering effects. Now, one of the problems you face in Bryce is because there's only limited render options in what it allows you to control, it's quite difficult to optimize your scene for certain effects, and you'll often find that render times rise alarmingly when you make small changes to material properties. If, for instance, introduces reflection when you've got true ambient rendering, for example, then render times go up. So by producing a reflection map, you can eliminate reflection, and this works well for when we want to switch to these blurry transmissions. So what I'm going to do is modify the options here. So we're setting our scene up. I'm going to lower the raise per pixel to 16 for previewing. I'm going to turn off true ambience. I'm going to switch on blurry transmissions, blurry reflections, and soft shadows. And I'm just going to show you what boost light does in this instance, because it does have an effect outside of the true ambience rendering. As I showed you in another video where you could create some snow effect on pine tree leaves. So I'm just going to cover that briefly by modifying the material now. Just give this a quick render to show you what it's like without the true ambience rendering. So this reflection effect there, that's just coming through ambience channel. You can see this reflection's blurred, and there's this object here. I'll just get rid of this object and the radial light because we're not going to need those, and I'll just go to our sphere here and point out the level of blur is dependent on the luminance of the specular halo value. So if I hold the Alt key down and click on that and select HLS, then I can reduce the luminance to 0, and that will mean that this will no longer be blurred when I render it. Okay, moving on to the materials then. With this setup, going to the material lab. The specular halo also controls the level of blur for the transmission. So if I make this 100% transmissive, so it's transparent now, because I've got blurred transmissions on, then the specular halo value is going to cause that to blur. I'm going to leave the refraction as air. If I turn it up higher than this, then it will start to introduce grazing angle reflection, and it will also affect the diffuse response. So I'm not going to bother with that. We're going to keep things fairly simple. So you can see this is lit up now. This is lit up because it's transmitting the light from the sky, which is our HDRI light. So it's actually producing an effect within the material, which is quite nice and an interesting effect, but it wasn't the one I was aiming for, so I'm not going to explore that any further here, other than to show you that this is affected by boost light because the background is HDRI light, and so it's got out of range values in it that can normally be displayed on the monitor. So even though the reflection doesn't look any different, the response within the material has changed thanks to HDRI lighting. So as things stand, it's going to be relevant whether I have boost light on or not, but bear in mind if you are incorporating HDRI lighting and HDRI backdrop in your scene and the transmission effects can pick up that background, then in that case the boost light will make a difference. Okay, so what I'm going to do at this point is reset the sky, turn the atmosphere off, set it to fully black, provide fully white global ambient to drive the ambient effect, and then I'm going to go into the Skylab, make sure I've got the shadow intensity set at 100 and turn shadow softness on and turn it up to its maximum value. I'm going to check out of that and you'll see at this point what the render looks like. Okay, so you will have noticed, no doubt, that we don't have any shadow here underneath this object, and that you can see now the sky is fully black, which is what I was aiming for. And this material's changed in its appearance again, and a lot of this appearance is coming from the diffuse effect. So for the time being in the material, what I'm going to do is turn the diffuse down to 0 and just look at the ambient effect now and how that looks. So okay, the ambient is providing some light in this object, and what I want to do is shift this towards more of a jade-like material. So what I need is these highlights plus some green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in another blob here while holding the control key down, and that will allow me to use this component as a mixer between these two components. So I'll still have my highlights, but I'm also going to introduce some colour. It's got red in here at the moment, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to modify this one first. So hold the shift key down, click on the name, find where basic is in your textures and go for basic slope, because that's easy to modify for this. So check out of there and click on the deep texture editor, select this first component and change the slope filter to a sine filter, and don't bother modifying it, as actually about the right value. If I just turn the colour off there, you'll see it's quite a high value. So that will tend to mix when it's going towards white in the alpha channel. For this, when you're doing this 3-channel mixing, it'll mix primarily for the B channel rather than the A channel. When it's dark here in the alpha channel, we're mixing for the A channel, but you can see it's given us red, and I'll just show you what that looks like now. So you can see we've kept the highlights, but now we've got some red in the mix. Well, red really wasn't what I was aiming for. I was aiming for green. So if I go into the texture source editor now, deep texture editor for my hypertexture, and there's no color output at the moment, so if I give it a color output here, it's getting the color from this first blob. So if I give this a greeny color, I don't know quite what to choose. That will do for now. I can always change it later. You can see it's now been adopted there because it's coming through the color channel. Check out of here, and I've now got a green. I might revise my view on that green later on, but for the time being that will do. Okay, next consideration then. Well, could do with something that is going to respond to the geometry, because I haven't got an absorber. That's my problem. If I try and overlap volumetric material to act as an absorber on this mesh with this material, where the meshes coincide, you'll create an error in the render engine, and if you offset them slightly, then you can tend to see them poking through. So I want to avoid that, plus the fact it will increase the render time alarmingly, and I'm trying to keep the render time down. So I'm going to use the function in the material here for transparent. So I could just choose, well, I could choose the green, for example, but that wouldn't really respond to the geometry. It would give me a shadow, as you can see, and it's darkened it considerably. But I want something that's going to actually look like it's subsurface scattering, which means you tend to get light transmission on these outer edges, and where it's thicker and darker, then you don't get it so much, and that will be the sort of the flat areas. So what I plan to do is put a blob in here, the D channel, and then hold the shift key down and click on the name and go to basic slope again, and modify this basic slope to be a curvature control. So I've tried to work out the easiest way to do this for you. If you click on here, change this first component to sine again, and then I'm going to just lift that up to maximum value, and then drag that over into component 2, and with that selected, take that down to, take it down to low value output. So we can now switch between these color swatches, because this one's controlling this color and that one's controlling that color. So I want a green, a dark green for this one, and a lighter green for that one. And then in order to get the curvature filter working, I can change the blend mode to blend curvature, and that gives me that kind of effect. So if I go from here, I need in the material options to engage find concave and hard edges, and at this point what this should achieve is that it will be sensing the convex surfaces and making them slightly lighter according to curvature. It will have an impact on render time. You don't get anything for free, but you can see now that those outer edges are looking a little bit lighter. I'll modify this further. I think possibly these greens are a little bit too saturated, so I'll lower the saturation. I'll increase the light output on this one, and I'm going to lower the saturation on this color that's provided in the mix, just to make things look a bit more natural, hopefully. So I'll just check out of there and see how that looks. Right, we're still missing diffusion, and that's going to give the impression of a predominant light source. So I'll go into the material now, and I'll give it some diffuse and see how that looks. I'll try 25 diffuse. I don't want to go over the top with this. So I've got our white highlights, we've got some diffuse. The other consideration is how much scattering in the material. So I'm going to leave it at its default level, but bear in mind the effect will change as you increase the luminance value of the specular light. So you can see this is looking a little bit more glass-like perhaps it might be worth at this point just experimenting with this. So I'll take the specular halo. At this midpoint it's quite difficult to see any scattering, but as it gets up higher and higher it seems to be a sort of a logarithmic response. So I'll try 230 and see how that looks. Okay, I don't want to belabor the point here because I know these videos tend to go on a bit long, so what the final thing to do then to make things look nice, because you notice I put in the render options blurry reflections, and that was because I wanted to do an anisotropic reflection on the ground plane here. So modify the ground plane material, put in anisotropy, change this color swatch to fully black and make it reflective, and then I'm going to use metallicity to darken it so it's a dark reflection, and then that will provide a blurred reflection of my object. And by darkening the background it'll give an impression of absorption within the material because I'm providing highlights through the curvature effect. So now it's not looking too bad. I might consider just increasing the diffuse response slightly for the material here, and then we can go for a final render. So I'll try I did the same thing again. 35, 35, 35, thank you. Okay, give that a quick render. So you can see at the moment we're looking at about 3 minutes, but this is only like a previewing level. So as your issue with the old transients, it's noise that is your enemy here, and this reflection is looking a bit dodgy actually, so I might just abandon the anisotropy and just do it blurred. So okay, just setting things up for final rendering. I want things to look nice. Okay, that looks okay, probably bright enough, bearing in mind these highlights. They seem to have got some effect along this edge here. That's probably due to the curvature. There certainly will be along there and there. We've lost the dodgy shadow region because I'm afraid that Bryce doesn't really handle caustics. You can just see the reflective sphere just here, and this should be a sharp reflection by the time it renders. And I've also got a couple of primitives in there to show the effect on the primitives. So 3 minutes, this is probably looking a bit noisy, so I would say 64 raised per pixel will give a good result, but it might take a little bit longer. So I'm aiming for a kind of 10-minute render time ideally. I'll let it have another assessment and see whether it's going to come down a bit. The first pass is always a little bit difficult to judge, and then I'll say that's it. So we're going for here quarter of an hour. I can live with that. Okay then, so that's the end of the video. Hope you found that interesting and that you'll experiment with these effects in your own renders. Oh, and I'll put this on the beginning of the video when it's done after about 15 minutes.